Today I am here to share a few thoughts with you about a very complex and tough subject, deconstruction. In fact, three terms, post-structuralism, postmodernism and deconstruction, are usually used interchangeably. Post-structuralism is actually a phase that has transcended and questioned most of the tenets of structuralism. Postmodernism actually represents a period or an era, perhaps after 1960, made popular and intense after Lyotard's famous work, The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge. And deconstruction is actually one of the strategies of post-structuralism. And therefore, these three terms actually belong to a family. Post-structuralism basically makes certain strong arguments. They say language is not a stable, closed system, and therefore a poem or a novel is not a closed entity with clear-cut meanings. Literature is irreducibly plural. There is endless play of signifiers, and there is no fixed center. You cannot claim any sort of scientific objectivity and comprehensiveness. And if you claim universal validity, you are actually being totalitarian. Post-structuralists prefer non-hierarchical plurality. That is, plurality or multiplicity without any type of hierarchy. And they also argue about the indeterminacy of the text. You cannot determine the quality, the content, the nature of any text. Meaning is always deferred, and therefore there is instability of meaning. They are also against fixed binary oppositions. Structuralists basically argue that meaning is created through a process of binaries, and these binaries are to a certain extent fixed. But post-structuralism is against any fixity in relation to binaries. They argue that there are no wholesome, holistic discourses. You will find an element of trans-aesthetics everywhere. One discipline is bordering on the other is bordering on the other. So, there is no fixity of a discourse. Ideas like death of the author propounded by Roland Barthes, the idea that literature is not an individual creation but emanations from a group by Foucault, the idea that signifying processes creates instability of meaning put forth by Julia Kristeva. All these ideas are in fact part of the concept of post-structuralism. It was into this ambit or ambience that the French thinker and philosopher Jacques Derrida arrives. I think two threads may have influenced Derrida in his pronouncements. One, that there is a disorder in communication. The concept of coding and decoding has been subverted. There is undecidability everywhere. Perhaps he was influenced by the concept of zombie in cinema. And one thing is certain, he was bothered by this concept of either or, this or that factor. And I believe he was certainly influenced by the idea of the pharmakon, which he had taken from Plato, where the word pharmakon means both cure and poison. So this dichotomy, this either or, this undecidability, this zombie state may have certainly influenced the writings and utterances of Derrida. In the West, writing is often privileged. But you have to agree that speech has a strange privilege, for example, in quotes, in oral thesis, in minutes, in inaugural addresses, etc. Writing was often concerned or considered to be corrupt, irrelevant. Speech, because it is current, has full presence, and writing is a sort of absence. The idea of deconstruction perhaps came to Derrida from Heidegger's concept of destruction. Most of the ideas of Derrida are found in his writings like Speech and Phenomena, of Grammatology, Writing and Difference, all these published in 1967. And the work Writing and Difference, in fact, has the seminal essay, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. People very dramatically argue that when this essay was presented at Johns Hopkins University, it was supposed to be a seminar on structuralism, and the moment Derrida made this presentation, it became the starting point of post-structuralism and automatically deconstruction. Deconstruction is actually a critique of the relationship between the text and meaning. Reading of text to run counter to meaning and structural unity. Complete meaning is actually always deferred or postponed and is also deferential. Derrida, in fact, ushers in post-structuralism with this essay, Structure, Sign and Play. He in fact begins his essay itself in a very self-reflexive mode when he argues that an event has taken place and this event is a rupture or a break, and it has left or it has led to a sort of doubling. Perhaps on the one hand you have structuralism and on the other you have post-structuralism. So it's a doubling. Derrida is always against a knowable center, a logocentrism. He is also against the concept of the metaphysics of presence and a transcendental signifier, which is a guarantee or center of meaning. The belief that the logos or the word is the center of everything, according to Derrida, is absurd. And the belief that every logos has an aura of itself, it has a metaphysics of presence, and it is a transcendental signifier, that it's a word, this word or this logos carries within it the guarantee of meaning, the answer to everything. Derrida opposes all these ideas. Derrida, in fact, inverts or rather dissolves hierarchies and shows that the repressed or marginalized term has already contaminated the central term. The word that is in the center of a system becomes decentered, and when this marginalized term decenters the central word, a trace is left behind. Derrida, in his deconstructive readings, releases his undecidables, which he calls radically unstable terms, to disrupt systematization. His argument is that every deconstructive reading tracks down within a text the aporia or central contradictions and shows how texts can be seen to deconstruct themselves. This term, which has become very popular, rather famous or infamous, can be defined actually as an impasse or a paradox. A point where a text's meaning can no longer be resolved, and therefore the text undermines itself. What deconstruction does is, it teases out signifiers from lethargy and concludes that the text's meanings are undecidable. Therefore, there is limitless possibility of interpretation. Derrida, in fact, uses a few case studies to show how deconstruction resolves or tries to subvert texts or discourses. He takes the case of ethnology, which is one of the 4 streams of anthropology. And he argues, earlier the benchmark of every study was Western discourse, or every study was Eurocentric. He then argues, with the entrance of the new discipline called ethnology, Eurocentrism was questioned and the ethnology became central. But he says, there's a problem here because the concept of ethnology itself is Western, and therefore we are using a very Western discourse to subvert Eurocentrism. This, he says, is a problem. Then he takes the case of Levi-Strauss and he uses the example of incest. And he says incest is both natural and cultural. He says incest is banned in almost all countries. It is considered to be an error, a wrong, a sin. And therefore, it is natural, because everywhere it is banned, incest is natural. But at the same time, this incest is man-made, and therefore it is artificial, and therefore it is cultural. So, incest is at the same time both natural and cultural. There is a cohabitation of nature versus culture. And Derrida goes on to problematize this, and he argues this cohabitation is a scandal. And this leads to the idea that in language there is a domain of the unthinkable. Like in the problems of ethnology and in the problem of nature versus culture scandal. language also bears within itself, carries within itself the domain of the unthinkable that is terribly problematic and needs to be questioned. He further takes on the case of the Bororos and he uses the Bororo myth as an example. While studying the Bororo myth, he comes to understand that the Bororos are a very complex set of people, how they are divided into different moieties. The moieties are further divided and they have their own culture and system and marriage ways, etc., etc. And then he argues, but this Bororo myth is not a central reference myth. You cannot imagine that by understanding the Bororo myth, you have understood everything about myths and mythology. So, a knowledge of the Bororos does not mean that you have knowledge of all myths. In anthropology, mythology and language, totalization is not possible because non-stop processes of play is always on. Free play is always on in all these disciplines. So, it is not possible to fix any discipline to any center. At one point, Derrida would say that you have this world of epistemology and you have these epistemes in it. You cannot argue that one episteme is the center in the system of epistemology because totalization is not possible. A new structure comes about out of a rupture with the past. And he says, two types of interpretation are possible. One tries to decipher the truth. It is actually like literary criticism. It tries to find out the truth, but the other type of interpretation is the one which affirms play, which you see in thinkers like Freud and Nietzsche. In fact, Derrida prefers the second type of interpretation, the one which looks for play. In fact, according to Derrida, language has within itself the need for its own critique. And he has a wonderful idea when he argues that when meaning is taken away from language, language becomes an experience. Derrida, in fact, opposes the ideas of Hegel because Derrida does not want his binaries to reach a synthesis. Hegel would argue for a thesis, antithesis, synthesis routine, but Derrida opposes that. He does not believe in this concept of synthesis because that would be another way of limiting free play and plurality. There have been many modern or rather postmodern intellectuals and thinkers who have had close connections with both post-structuralism and deconstruction. One may argue that many of these thinkers had their own concepts of post-structuralism and deconstruction, and the Yale School of Deconstruction is very popular. For example, Paul Deman argues that in deconstructive reading, you actually try to decipher the conflict between the rhetorical and the grammatical. That is, when you go for a deconstructive reading, there is always a conflict between the rhetorical or the aesthetic part and the grammatical part. It is this conflict that makes a deconstructive reading possible. Richard Rorty argues that the accidental features of a text subverts its essential message. This is actually one argument which Derrida also put forth, the concept of aporia. The aporias, or the silences, or the blocks, or the gaps in a text enable the reader to go for multiple readings, because every aporia leaves the text wide open. This is what Rorty argues, that the accidental features of a text subverts its essential message. Sometimes the message which the author or the writer intended may have been something else, but these accidental features or these aporias embedded in the text subverts the conventionality of the text and creates a new text, which you can say is actually the death of the author and the birth of the reader, another post-structuralist idea. John Caputo has a very curious definition of deconstruction when he says, deconstruction is breaking a nutshell to break tranquility. It's actually a very poetic definition, breaking a nutshell to break tranquility. So, the tranquil realms of the text is broken by deconstruction. So, it's no more, a text is no more a placid lake, it gets disturbed, which leads to free play and multiplicity of readings and meanings. Paul Ricoeur believes that deconstruction uncovers the questions behind the answers of a text or tradition. See, the answers are already there, but deconstruction uncovers the questions, not the answers. The answers are there embedded in the text, lay hidden in the text, and deconstruction creates questions for these answers. That's a new way of looking at things. That itself is actually a minuscule definition of deconstruction, doing things the opposite way. Richard Ellman argues that deconstruction, or rather deconstructive reading, is systematic undoing of understanding. That is, don't sit there quietly, happily, with lethargy, believing that you have the answers for everything, you have understood everything, etc. Because deconstruction believes in breaking this belief, and it is a systematic destruction of understanding. Derrida, in fact, has a very pithy statement on this when he argues that every discourse has within it seeds of deconstruction. Every discourse. A discourse itself is something which is regenerative, and deconstruction finds out or traces out these elements within every discourse by scattering seeds of deconstruction. Now, essays on deconstruction, writings on deconstruction have in fact spread or scattered plenty of terms and jargons which have actually enhanced the study of literature, the readings of literature, the analysis and interpretations of texts. For example, the concept of aporia, where Derrida argues that the deconstructive reader searches for aporias or silences in every text, and using these aporias he comes to the conclusion that the meaning of the text cannot be decided upon, and therefore the text is left bare. So this concept of aporia has become very popular in deconstructive reading and deconstructive studies. Then he has used the portmanteau word deference, which has actually evolved from the structuralist idea that every word is generated or gets its meaning from a process of difference and deference. It means every word gets its meaning by being different from the other, and at the same time the meaning is postponed or deferred to another moment. While speaking about decentering, how the logos, how the central term is decentered, Derrida uses the concept of supplement. You decenter the central by supplementing it. So the supplemented word changes the position of the center. So the concept of supplement has become very strong and real in deconstructive studies. Another cluster of terms which is very popular with Derrida is the concept of logocentrism, phonocentrism and graphocentrism, where he makes the argument that the spoken word is considered to be supreme in language, but he says, and language or written language is considered to be a parasite. But Derrida opposes that, and he speaks in favor of graphocentrism or writing. He also speaks about the concept of arche and telos, that is, being inside and outside. Where does meaning reside? Is it inside or outside? He would argue that it is a combination of the arche and the telos. The meaning would be both inside and outside. He also has some very complex ideas like arche writing, where he speaks that arche writing is writing that precedes both speech and writing, and it is already there before we use it. So, such concepts in deconstruction have certainly added to the depth and dimension of post-structuralist thought and deconstructive studies, and in the process deconstructive reading of text, which has certainly helped not only in understanding written text but also in understanding visual arts, dance, architecture and other postmodern forms that have opened up the arenas of appreciation and aesthetics.